The wind on the ridge had a different voice than the wind in the flats. It was a thinner sound, a high keen that promised an early frost and found every loose thread in the grey scarf tied around Adeline's neck. She pulled the worn wool tighter, her knuckles white against the faded pink of her dress. The wagon wheel groaned, a sound of protest that had been her only companion for the last 2 days, besides the small, steady breathing of the child beside her. Posy sat straight-backed on the rough plank seat, her small hands folded in the lap of her brown dress, her gaze fixed on the structure that was slowly resolving itself out of the pines. It was less a house and more of a suggestion, a thing built from stubbornness and scrap. The roof sagged in the middle like the spine of an old horse, and the single window was a dark, vacant eye. This was it. This was all her grandmother Rose had left, this piece of high, lonely ground and the shack that clung to it. Adeline felt no rush of sentiment, no sense of homecoming. She felt only the familiar, leaden weight of a new problem to be solved. She pulled the mule to a halt. The silence that rushed in was immense, broken only by that thin, whistling wind. Posy slid from the seat, landing softly in the dust. She didn't run towards the cabin. She stood and watched it, her head tilted. "Is this Grandma Rose's castle?" Her voice was small against the backdrop of the mountain. Adeline managed a sound that was almost a laugh, dry as a husk. Something like that. She moved to the back of the wagon, her body aching with a weariness that went deeper than the journey. Unloading their meager possessions felt like a final admission of defeat. 2 thin bedrolls, a crate of tinned goods, a heavy iron skillet. A life boiled down to what one mule could pull. Inside, the cabin smelled of cold ash and mice and something else, something herbal and faintly bitter, the ghost of her grandmother's remedies. A single room. A stone hearth, a rickety table, a bed frame roped with sagging cord. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of light slicing through the grimy window. It was worse than she remembered. Colder. Smaller. While Posy explored the corners with the solemn curiosity of a field mouse, Adeline knelt at the hearth, testing the flue. Her fingers, chapped and rough, brushed against a floorboard that gave slightly under the pressure. It was nothing. A loose nail, a warp in the wood. But it was different from the others. She pressed again. A faint scraping sound, wood on stone. Her breath caught. She glanced at Posy, who was now humming to a spider web in the corner. Adeline ran her fingers along the edge of the board. It wasn't nailed down. It was fitted, cut with a precision that belied the rest of the cabin's crude construction. A knot of unease tightened in her stomach, a feeling she had learned to trust. It was the feeling that came before the rent was due, before a cough turned into a fever. It was the feeling of a world about to shift under her feet. She tried to put the floorboard from her mind. There were more pressing concerns. The roof needed patching before the first snow, the chimney had to be swept, and the small store of firewood left by the door wouldn't last a week. Survival was a litany of relentless tasks, and there was no room in it for mysteries. For 3 days, she worked from the thin light of dawn to the deep, star-pricked dark of dusk, her movements efficient and spare. She chinked the walls with mud and dried grass, her hands raw and caked with dirt. She scrubbed the floor until the scent of lye overpowered the smell of decay. She made the space clean, if not warm. She made it hers. Posy was a quiet shadow at her side, gathering kindling into small, neat piles or arranging pebbles in patterns on the stoop. The child's resilience was a constant, quiet miracle. She did not complain about the cold, or the thin soup, or the silence. She simply was. But at night, curled under the threadbare quilt, she would ask the questions Adeline could not answer. Did Grandma Rose sing songs? Posy's voice was a sleepy murmur in the dark. No, sweetling. I don't think she did. Adeline stared at the rough-hewn beams above them, seeing the stern, unsmiling face of the woman who had raised her. Rose had been a creature of stone and silence, her hands always busy, her voice always rough. Did she have a pretty dress? She wore grey. Always grey like your scarf. Yes. Just like that. Adeline tucked the quilt tighter around her daughter's shoulders. These questions were like small stones Posy kept placing in her hands, forcing her to feel the weight of a past she had tried so hard to leave behind. She had not come here to remember. She had come here because there was nowhere else to go. The last of the flour was gone by the 4th day, scraped from the bottom of the sack to make a thin gravy. The salt was next. The trip to town was unavoidable, a prospect that settled like a cold dread in her gut. The town of redemption was not a place of comfort for her. It was a place of averted eyes and whispered condemnations, the place she had fled 2 years ago with a broken heart and a swelling belly. Going back felt like walking willingly into a cage. But Posy needed salt. She needed flour. So Adeline harnessed the mule, brushed the dust from her pink dress, and tied the grey scarf firmly under her chin, a piece of armor against the stares she knew were coming. The town hadn't changed. It huddled in the valley, a collection of false-fronted buildings staring at each other across a wide, dusty street. As she led the mule toward the mercantile, she felt the familiar shift in atmosphere. Conversations that paused as she passed. Windows that suddenly required cleaning. She kept her eyes fixed on the boardwalk in front of her, her spine rigid. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her falter. She would get what she needed and leave. Inside the mercantile, the air was thick with the scent of coffee beans, leather, and smoked bacon. It was a smell of prosperity, of lives that were not lived on the edge of a cliff. She made her purchases quickly, her voice low as she spoke to the shopkeeper, who counted her coins with a deliberate slowness that was its own kind of insult. As she stepped back onto the boardwalk, a man blocked her path. He was dressed in a fine wool suit, his boots polished to a high shine despite the dust of the street. Mr. Hemlock. The town banker. He tipped his hat, a smile on his face that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. Mrs. Stowe. I heard you'd returned to your grandmother's property. He used the titles Mrs. like a weapon, a reminder of what she was not. Adeline simply nodded, clutching her parcel of flour and salt. I am sorry for your loss. Rose was a fixture of this community. The lie was so smooth, so practiced. Rose had been no more a fixture of the community than a hawk circling high above it. The bank holds a small note against the property, he continued, his tone conversational. A matter of some overdue taxes. Hardly worth mentioning, but I find myself in a position to help. The land is useless for grazing, of course. All rock and pine. But for sentimental reasons, I would be prepared to offer you $50 to take it off your hands. Settle the debt and leave you with a little something to start fresh. Somewhere else the offer hung in the air, too quick, too neat. $50 was nothing, not even for land as poor as he described. It was the price of a good horse. It was an insult. A flicker of her grandmother's stubbornness sparked within her. The same instinct that had made her press on the loose floorboard flared again. Something was wrong. Thank you for the offer, Mr. Hemlock, she said, her voice even. But I am not looking to sell. His smile tightened almost imperceptibly at the edges. A woman alone, with a child, it's a hard life up on that mountain. Think on it. He tipped his hat again and was gone, leaving Adeline with a cold knot of suspicion in her stomach. The journey back up the mountain was different. The trees seemed to press closer, the shadows darker. Hemlock's offer echoed in her mind, not as a kindness, but as a threat. Back in the cabin, the chill felt deeper than before. Posy was asleep, exhausted from the trip. In the quiet, Adeline went to the hearth. The floorboard beckoned. This time, she did not hesitate. Using the tip of her belt knife, she pried at the edge. The board lifted with a soft groan, revealing a dark, hollow space beneath. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Reaching into the cold darkness, her fingers brushed against something wrapped in oiled cloth. It was heavy, dense. She pulled it out. It was a bundle, tied securely with twine. With trembling fingers, she unwrapped it on the table. Inside were not coins or jewelry, but a stack of hand-drawn maps on stiff, yellowed paper, and a small, leather-bound journal filled with a tight, spidery script. Her grandmother's handwriting. She unrolled the first map. It was a drawing of the land around the cabin, the ridges and creeks rendered with an astonishing, painstaking detail. But it was covered in strange symbols, in fine, spidery lines that followed the contours of the rock formations. There were notes in the margins, words she didn't understand. Argentite seam. Chalcopyrite trace. Quartz intrusion. It was a language she did not speak. She opened the journal. The entries were not personal. They were dated observations. October 12th followed the Western Fork. Outcropping shows significant galena presence 3 feet below the surface. November 3rd, snow came early. The blast point at the northern ridge is compromised. Must shore it before the freeze. Blast point? This wasn't the diary of a lonely old woman. It was the logbook of a prospector. A geologist. Adeline sank onto the stool, the papers spread before her like a forbidden history. Her grandmother, the silent, grim woman who made bitter teas and never wasted a word, had been mapping this mountain. Secretly. Methodically. For years. And Mr. Hemlock wanted it for $50. The next morning, Adeline hid the maps and journal back in their hollow and replaced the floorboard, the secret once again concealed beneath the hearth. But now the cabin felt different. The silence was no longer empty, it was filled with the ghost of her grandmother's hidden work. The very rocks outside the window seemed to hold a different meaning. Adeline knew she was standing on the edge of something vast and dangerous, and she was utterly alone. She couldn't read the maps with any real understanding, and she couldn't trust anyone in town. Hemlock's influence ran deep, like the roots of the pines. To ask the wrong person for help would be to deliver the secret directly into his hands. Then she remembered a man she had seen only once, on her frantic trip to file the deed of inheritance. The county clerk. He was a small, stooped man with ink-stained fingers and spectacles so thick they made his eyes look like they were swimming. He hadn't stared or whispered. He had simply been correct. Methodical. He had treated her with a dry, impersonal courtesy that felt, in that moment, like the greatest kindness. His name was Finch. She wrapped one of the smaller, less detailed maps in a piece of cloth, bundled Posey in her warmest shawl, and made the journey back down the mountain. The county office was a small, quiet room that smelled of aging paper and dust. Mr. Finch was perched on his stool behind a high counter, writing in a large ledger with a nib pen that scratched rhythmically in the silence. He looked up as she entered, his magnified eyes blinking slowly. "Miss," he said. It wasn't a Mrs., it was a simple, factual acknowledgement. "I need some help," Adeline began, her voice barely a whisper. She felt foolish, out of her depth. "I found this among my grandmother's things." "I don't know what it is." She placed the cloth-wrapped map on the counter. Mr. Finch wiped his pen carefully before picking up the bundle. He unrolled the map, his long, thin fingers smoothing the curled edges. He was silent for a long time, his gaze moving back and forth across the paper. He adjusted his spectacles, leaning closer. He traced one of the spidery lines with a clean fingernail. "This is a geological survey," he said finally, his voice raspy from disuse. "And a remarkably detailed one. The triangulation is precise. The notation, unorthodox, but clear." He looked at her over the top of his glasses. "Where did you say you found this?" "In her cabin." "There are more." The admission felt like a confession. "My grandmother, Rose." He nodded slowly, his eyes returning to the map. "I see." He tapped a section of the map. "This mark here. This denotes a load-bearing quartz vein. According to this, a significant one. The official county survey of that quadrant is less detailed. It marks the whole area as granite schist. Unstable and worthless." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Mr. Hemlock financed that survey 2 years ago, on behalf of the railroad's timber interests." The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. Hemlock didn't just want the land. He knew what was in it. He had a map that said it was worthless, and he knew she had a map that said it was not. "He offered me $50 for it," she said, the words tasting like ash. Mr. Finch's thin lips pressed into a grim line. "Of course he did." He looked from the map to her, and then to Posey, who was quietly watching them both. "This map is a claim, miss. A powerful one, if it can be proven. But a dangerous one to possess. Mr. Hemlock is not a man who likes complications. Adeline returned to the mountain with Mr. Finch's words echoing in her ears. A dangerous one to possess. The cabin no longer felt like a refuge, however meager. It felt exposed, a tiny, fragile shell on a vast and coveted piece of land. She spent the evening with all the maps spread on the floor, the lantern light casting long, dancing shadows. She wasn't just looking at lines on paper anymore. She was looking at her grandmother's life. She saw the years of secret labor, the lonely treks up the ridges, the patient, meticulous work of a mind that the world had dismissed. She remembered things she hadn't thought of in years. Rose, returning at dusk, her skirts caked with mud, her hands raw. Rose, sitting by the fire, not resting, but sharpening the tip of a small rock hammer. Rose, staring at the horizon not with vacant eyes, but with the focused gaze of a surveyor, reading the story written in the bones of the earth. All the things Adeline had interpreted as bitterness or eccentricity were, in fact, the signs of a hidden, passionate purpose. Her grandmother hadn't been a grim recluse. She had been a scientist without a laboratory, an explorer without a commission. She had been protecting something. Posey, drawn by the papers on the floor, crawled over and pointed a small finger at one of the maps. That looks like the big rock by the creek. Adeline looked where she was pointing. It was true. The drawing perfectly matched the shape of a large outcropping where they had stopped for water that morning. Her grandmother hadn't just mapped the mountain, she had known its every feature, its every secret. Later, as Adeline was sweeping the hearth, Posey came to her, holding something in her small hand. It was a stone, smooth and heavy, dark grey with a faint, bluish metallic streak running through it. Grandma Rose used this to hold the door open, she said. Adeline took the stone. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, unnaturally so. It felt cool and dense in her palm. She turned it over and over, the single bluish vein catching the light. She had seen that stone 1,000 times, had kicked it out of the way, had cursed it when she stubbed her toe on it. She had never truly looked at it. Now, holding it, she felt a jolt of recognition. It wasn't just a rock. It was a sample. It was the physical proof of the lines on the maps. Her grandmother hadn't just left her a drawing of a treasure, she had left a piece of it on the doorstep, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to finally see it for what it was. Adeline closed her hand around the stone, its weight a solid, grounding presence. It was more than a rock. It was a testament. It was an inheritance. The sound of hoofbeats came 2 days later, a sharp, intrusive rhythm that did not belong to the mountain. Adeline was outside, splitting kindling, the steady chop of the axe a counterpoint to the wind in the pines. She froze, axe in hand, and saw 2 riders approaching. One was Mr. Hemlock. The other was a man she didn't know, a large, impassive man who looked like he was carved from the same granite her grandmother had been mapping. Adeline's hand went to the pocket of her dress, where the heavy, smooth or sample now lived. She did not move as they reined in their horses a few feet from her. Posey, who had been arranging pine cones near the stoop, came to stand silently behind her mother's skirts. "Miss Doe," Hemlock said, foregoing any pretense of the title or Mrs. this time. His voice was flat, stripped of its earlier, false cordiality. "I've come to discuss the matter of the property taxes." He dismounted, pulling a folded paper from his coat pocket. "According to the county assessor, your grandmother was in arrears for 3 years. The total, with interest and fees, comes to $112. He held the paper out to her. Adeline didn't take it. The sum was impossible, a king's ransom. It was a death sentence for her claim. A debt the bank has, of course, acquired, Hemlock continued smoothly. "I am a reasonable man. I am prepared to forgive the entire amount in exchange for the deed." He gestured vaguely at the cabin, the trees. "Relieve you of this burden." His gaze flickered towards Posey, a brief, cold assessment. "It's no place to raise a child. The winters are harsh. Accidents happen. It would be a tragedy if something were to befall you up here, all alone." The threat was no longer veiled. It was laid bare, as stark and ugly as a stripped tree. Adeline could feel Pose's small hand gripping the fabric of her dress. The wind whipped a strand of hair across her face, and she didn't brush it away. For her entire life, she had been running. Running from the town, from her past, from the shame the world had tried to heap upon her. But standing there, on this small patch of land her grandmother had secretly charted, with her daughter behind her and a piece of the mountain in her pocket, the urge to run was gone. It was replaced by something cold and hard and immovable. "The land is not for sale, Mr. Hemlock," she said. Her voice didn't tremble. It was as quiet and steady as the mountain itself. Hemlock's eyes narrowed. The mask of civility was gone completely, revealing the raw avarice beneath. "You are making a grave mistake." "I don't think I am," she replied. He stared at her for a long moment, then snatched the paper back, mounted his horse, and rode away without another word, the big man following like a shadow. Adeline watched them go, her heart pounding a slow, heavy drumbeat against her ribs. She had not won. She had only declared war. The next day, before the sun had fully risen over the ridge, Adeline was on her way back to town. She carried the entire bundle of maps and the journal, wrapped carefully and hidden in her satchel. The ensemble was a reassuring weight in her pocket. She went directly to the county office. Mr. Finch was already there, the green shade of his lamp casting a small pool of light in the dim, pre-dawn office. He looked up, and his expression showed no surprise, only a weary resignation, as if he had been expecting her. She laid the entire bundle on the counter between them. "He came to the cabin," she said, her voice low. "He threatened me." Mr. Finch listened without interruption as she recounted the visit, his face a careful, unreadable mask. When she was finished, he slowly untied the bundle and began to lay the maps out, one by one, under the lamplight. He studied them with an intense, focused silence, occasionally consulting the small journal. The only sound was the rustle of old paper and the scratching of his pen as he made a few notes on a separate sheet. "The man is a thief," he said at last, not looking up. "He's using the railroad's timber survey as a cover to suppress the mineral value of the quadrant. He buys the land for pennies from homesteaders like your grandmother, knowing full well what lies beneath. He leveraged their debts against them." He finally looked at her, his magnified eyes seeming to see right through her fear to the core of her resolve. "These maps are your grandmother's testimony. But a testimony is only as good as the court that will hear it." He took off his spectacles and polished them with a handkerchief. "The circuit judge is a fool, and Hemlock owns him. We need someone Hemlock can't buy." He paused. "The territorial marshal is in town. Marshal Reed. He's here about a dispute over water rights. He is an honest man. Which makes him a difficult 1-inch." Mr. Finch repacked the maps with deliberate care. "Come with me." He led her from the quiet office, out into the morning chill, and across the street to the town's small hotel. The marshal was in the dining room, alone at a corner table, drinking coffee. He was a tall, lean man with a weathered face and eyes the color of a winter sky. He looked up as they approached, his gaze neutral but missing nothing. Mr. Finch made the introductions. "Marshal, this is Miss Adeline Stowe. She has a claim I believe you need to see." Adeline felt small and out of place in her faded dress, but she met the marshal's steady gaze. She watched as Mr. Finch unrolled the first map on the table. Marshal Reed did not speak. He leaned forward, studying the intricate lines, his eyes tracing the same paths her grandmother's hands must have taken. He picked up the journal, flipping through the pages of dense, scientific observation. Then Adeline took the stone from her pocket and placed it on the table. It made a soft, heavy sound against the wood. The marshal picked it up, tested its weight in his hand, and examined the blue-gray vein. He looked from the stone to the map, then back to Adeline. He still hadn't said a word. The silence stretched, thick with consequence. Finally, he looked at Mr. Finch. "You verified the claim markers?" "They match the original patent survey exactly, Marshal. The anomaly is what's in the ground, not where the boundaries are." The marshal set the stone down carefully. He looked at Adeline, and for the first time, his expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman, miss. It wasn't a promise of victory. It wasn't a guarantee of safety. But it was a validation. It was the truth, spoken aloud by a man whose words carried weight. The hearing was set for the following week, not in a proper courtroom, but in the town hall, a large, drafty room that smelled of stale cigar smoke and floor polish. The news had spread through Redemption like a grass fire. The room was packed with curious townspeople, their faces a mixture of suspicion, pity, and greedy speculation. Mr. Hemlock sat at a table with a slick, confident lawyer from the capital, his papers arranged in neat, intimidating stacks. He looked calm, powerful, a man entirely in his element. Adeline sat at the opposite table with Mr. Finch. She wore the same pink dress, now patched at the elbow, and the grey scarf. She had no stack of papers, only the worn bundle of maps and her grandmother's journal. Posey was with the mercantile owner's wife, a woman who had surprised Adeline with a quiet offer of help, her eyes holding a flicker of solidarity. The circuit judge, a man with a florid face and an air of immense self-importance, called the proceedings to order. Hemlock's lawyer spoke first. He was eloquent and dismissive. He painted a picture of Rose as an eccentric, uneducated recluse, her so-called maps the delusional scribblings of a lonely mind. He presented the official, Hemlock-funded survey, its clean lines and official seals a stark contrast to Rose's hand-drawn papers. He then turned his attention to Adeline, his voice dripping with condescending pity. He spoke of her as a desperate, unwed mother, incapable of managing such an estate, suggesting she was concocting this fantasy of mineral wealth to escape her unfortunate circumstances. He was trying to invalidate not just the claim, but Adeline herself. When it was her turn, Adeline felt 100 pairs of eyes on her. Her hands were cold, her throat dry. Mr. Finch gave her a small, encouraging nod. She did not stand to address the judge. She remained seated and asked Mr. Finch to unroll the largest map on the table. The room fell silent as the intricate, web-like drawing was revealed. "My grandmother was not a delusional woman," Adeline said, her voice quiet but carrying in the stillness. "She was an observer. She didn't speak of legal terms or geological data. She spoke of what she knew. I remember her hands. They were never clean. They always had dirt from the mountain under the nails. She would sit for hours on the porch, not sleeping, but watching the way the light hit the western ridge at sunset. She knew where the water ran after a storm, and where the snows were deepest in winter. These lines," she said, tracing one with her finger, "are not a fantasy. They are the story of her life's work." She picked up the journal. "This book does not speak of loneliness. It speaks of discovery. It speaks of galena, and quartz, and argentite. It speaks the language of the earth." A language she taught herself. Then she placed the heavy ore sample on top of the map. The sound echoed in the silent room. And this was her doorstop. A few people chuckled, but the sound died quickly. The simple, domestic detail made the fantastic claim suddenly, powerfully real. She had presented her truth, not as a legal argument, but as a biography. It was all she had. The judge, looking flustered and clearly swayed by Hemlock's lawyer, was about to speak when a voice cut through the room from the back. "I have something to add to these proceedings." Marshal Reed stepped forward, his boots making a slow, deliberate sound on the wooden floor. He held a slim portfolio in his hand. All eyes turned to him. Even Hemlock looked momentarily surprised, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. "This is the preliminary report from territorial geologist Micah Aubrey," the marshal said, his voice calm and authoritative as he approached the judge's bench. "Mr. Aubrey was passing through the territory last fall. At my request, he conducted a discreet, secondary survey of the quadrant in question. Following up on certain inconsistencies in the railroad's report, he opened the portfolio and laid a new map on the judge's bench. It was a professional, state-sanctioned document, but the lines denoting mineral veins on it were nearly identical to the ones on the map Adeline's grandmother had drawn. Mr. Aubrey's findings," the marshal continued, his gaze now fixed on a visibly paling Mr. Hemlock, "confirm the presence of a significant silver lode, one of the richest he's seen in this territory. A lode that the official survey, financed by Mr. Hemlock, somehow failed to notice." The room erupted in murmurs. Hemlock's lawyer shot to his feet, objecting loudly, but the marshal ignored him. Fraudulently suppressing a geological survey to acquire land under false pretenses is a federal matter, the marshal said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. A very serious one. The judge, his face now the color of putty, stared at the marshal's report. The game was over? The room knew it. Hemlock knew it. He didn't say a word. He simply sat, his empire of deceit crumbling around him in the silent, dusty room. The judge, stammering, declared Adeline's inheritance and mineral claim to be valid and indisputable. It wasn't a dramatic victory. There was no gavel bang that shook the world. It was a quiet, bureaucratic unraveling. Hemlock wasn't dragged away in chains, he was simply ruined, his reputation and his credit turned to dust by a quiet lawman and a dead woman's meticulous drawings. Adeline felt not a rush of triumph, but a profound, bone-deep wave of relief. She had not just saved her home. She had reclaimed her grandmother's name. She had given her a voice, long after she had been silenced. As she left the town hall, Mr. Finch walking beside her, she felt the town's eyes on her again. But the stares were different now. The whispers were not of shame, but of awe. She was no longer just the unwed mother who had returned in disgrace. She was the woman who had faced down the banker and won. The light was different on the mountain. It was the same sun, the same sky, but it fell differently through the pines, casting shadows that now seemed protective instead of menacing. The cabin was unchanged, still a stubborn, sagging little shack clinging to the mountainside, but it felt like a fortress. It felt like a home. Adeline stood on the porch, her hands resting on the worn railing. She was not wearing the grey scarf. It lay folded on the table inside, its duty done. The air was crisp, carrying the clean, sharp scent of pine and the promise of snow, but for the first time, the cold did not feel like a threat. It was just a season, and she was ready for it. She had a future now. It was not an easy one. The silver was still in the ground, a secret waiting for hard work and honest partners to bring it into the light. There would be legal papers to file, companies to negotiate with, a world of business she knew nothing about. But the fear was gone. It had been replaced by a quiet, steady competence she hadn't known she possessed. She had her grandmother's maps, her grandmother's mind, and a strength she now realized had been in her blood all along. Posy was sitting on the ground below the porch, a stick in her hand. She was not just doodling. She was drawing in the dirt, her small face a mask of concentration. Adeline watched her, a smile touching her lips. Posy was tracing the shape of the western ridge, then drawing a fine, spidery line from its peak down into the valley. She was drawing her great-grandmother's map from memory. Adeline looked up from her daughter to the ridgeline itself, the dark spine of the mountain against the pale blue sky. She saw it now as Rose must have seen it, not as a barrier, but as a promise. A story written in stone, waiting for someone with enough patience and love to learn how to read it. She finally understood the silence of her grandmother, the sternness, the hard hands. It wasn't a lack of love. It was a fierce, all-consuming focus. Rose had been building a legacy, not of words or affection, but of rock and truth. She had been charting a future for a granddaughter she knew would need a place to stand, a piece of the world that was unshakably hers. "Mama," Posy said, not looking up from her drawing. "Can you tell me a story about Grandma Rose now?" Adeline knelt in the dirt beside her daughter, her patched pink dress brushing against the earth. She picked up a small, smooth stone and placed it in Posy's hand. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong in the mountain air. "I can."